Hello and welcome to the MBOM podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. MBOM is a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at MBOM, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hello, friends, and welcome back for another episode of Mastering the Business of Yoga. I'm really excited that you're joining me for today's episode of the show, and one of the last episodes of 2021, which is super, super crazy. Next week, we'll be doing our 2021 year in review, and I just cannot believe that it's already that time of year. But in the meantime, we've got a really, really great episode for you today. And this week's episode of the show is brought to you in part by Offering Tree. And you've heard me talk about Offering Tree quite a bit. Offering Tree is a company that I know and love and is just my number one recommendation for the majority of yoga teachers when it comes to their yoga businesses. They have options for websites, for email lists, for scheduling programs, classes, for taking payments, and so much more. I'm going to tell you a lot more about Offering Tree later on in the episode, but if you want to get started with them, check them out. Head on over to offeringtree.com/MBOM. Of course, you can start completely for free, but that link will also give you 15% off any paid plans. So go ahead and check it out. And this week on the podcast, I am excited to be joined by Emily Perron. Emily helps yoga teachers and online entrepreneurs expand and improve their teams with talented freelancers. Her number one goal is to align the right person with the right role, so business owners and freelancers alike feel empowered to work with their individual skill sets and strengths. Her expertise really lies in hiring and managing within your zone of genius. And if you're not familiar with that term, which I wasn't super familiar with, she is going to walk us through what that means and how to look for it in her own businesses. And so in this episode, she shares how we know when we're ready to hire, how to identify what to hire for, including what is in our zone of genius and what isn't, as well as some of her top tips for putting together an awesome job posting that will help you get the right person into your business. And I talk a lot about this during the episode, my own experience with hiring an accountant, a podcast producer, and a virtual assistant, and just how amazing that experience has been. And even if you're somebody who feels like, hey, I'm not really at the point where I'm making enough revenue or enough income to hire somebody, I think this episode's really valuable to just get you started thinking about when it might be the right time for you, what you might want to hire for, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of goodness in this episode. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. And without further ado, here is Emily. Welcome to the podcast today, Emily. I'm really excited to have you here with me today.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks. I'm really excited to be with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation and for this episode and to dive in. And to start with, do you think you can just, introduce yourself a little, tell people a bit about yourself and your business and what you do?
Yeah. So I've been in business now for a little over 6 years. I spent about 10 years in the corporate world, and I have always been really interested in people and had this interest in hiring. And so for a while I was a hiring manager, and I was also the person that people went to when they needed help with the hiring process. So in my department or my division at the Fortune 500 company, I would just be that extra resource, sitting in on interviews, helping, pick candidates, going through resumes and cover letters and picking our interviews and things like that. And so I had this interest. And then I also, while I was in the corporate world, I earned a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology. And I was working in marketing at the time, but I had this psych background already. And so it was a really good fit. And I thought I'd be, heading eventually in more of that human resources direction. And so I actually ended up leaving my job in 2015, and I started my business as a career coach. and was like really working around meaningful work, helping people understand like their zone of genius and how to align that work, how to align their work with it, like how to actually get the job that's in better alignment with them and their interests and who they were. And so like all of that, then I started hiring pretty early because I had this background, right? I had this education, I had this experience in hiring, and I was like, I can do this. Like, I just need a few hours of help on my content. If I could get a little help with my content, I will be better and I will be able to grow faster. And I believed in it, right? I believed like we have to hire support. And so I did it. And then I made basically every mistake you can make within about 2 to 3 years. And even the first few mistakes in the first year, I thought, I've got to figure this out. Like there was no one out there teaching these things. No one is teaching you how to find freelancers. So much of the advice is for employees, like full-time employees. And that was just too big. That's not what I needed. I needed some blog editing. I needed some social media content. I didn't need to spend tens of thousands of dollars on a full-time employee. So that's kind of where it started. I set out to get it. And then I learned a lot along the way. And my business friends eventually started asking me for help in 2018 around what was I doing to find freelancers. And so that's how I got into recruiting. I got my first few clients, and then it's just kind of like snowballed from there the last few years. And I couldn't be happier about it because it's such a need. There's still not a lot of people speaking to these issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I completely agree. And I think one thing you touched on that I think is really relevant to both myself and to people listening is this idea of maybe recognizing that being like a one man or a one woman show is like no longer working for you, but feeling kind of like, well, I'm not making enough money to pay somebody like a livable salary, like a livable full-time salary. Like I can't pay somebody like $45,000, $50,000 a year. And we're not really taught this idea of like, hey, you can hire somebody for like 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week or 5 hours a week. And I feel like this was a concept that was something that like I kind of went through in my business a couple of years ago, where I was like, well, I need a little bit of help, but like I can't hire somebody full time. Like I'm not at that point. I'm not even at the point of hiring somebody, technically part time of like 20 hours. Is it possible to get somebody to just help with certain projects? And when I found out like, yeah, you can do that, certainly you can hire people on for specific things. I feel like that was such a game changer for me. Can you talk a little bit about, that concept of like maybe going through the growth in your business where you recognize you need some help, yet not full-time help, and kind of where we go from there?
Yeah, I think one thing I think to keep in mind with this, like you were saying, like an hour or two a week, I think part of it is just recognizing like what you're willing to give up to get the support and what you can pursue, like what you're opening up, especially if you're outsourcing things you're either not doing or are really draining for you. If you can open up that energy to spend, more time on the things that you are good and that you are passionate about, it's kind of like this shift we all have to make, right? I think one of the things that really helped me make the shift myself was thinking about it in terms of like actual dollars. So at least in the United States where I'm based, you can hire a lot of freelancers around that $30 to $35 an hour mark. It's a very common zone for freelancers. So at $30 an hour, if you only need 3 hours of support a week, or even like you can set that limit, right? You could even set like, this is all I can afford right now, but still less than $100 a week, you can start getting some things off of your plate. It's so worth it because it's just this value exchange, right? In terms of if you can, like maybe you're paid more to teach a yoga class or you're paid more to be somewhere else, you can offset that time. It's like amplifying yourself or multiplying yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's so helpful to put in perspective, like the idea of, $30 an hour, 3 hours a week, it's $90 a week. Can you afford to pay somebody that? And then thinking about, what does freeing up 3 hours of my like admin time a week do for me in my business. And I think it's easy to kind of think about, oh, it doesn't actually do that much. It's not that much time. But one thing I found is just having, somebody who can help me like 5 hours a week has been amazing. Like in terms of maximizing my productivity, it's been hugely helpful to be able to pass off some small tasks that were taking me a bunch of time that now I can pay somebody else to do. And then I can focus on other areas in my business that help with growth.
Yes, exactly. And really when you're outsourcing those 3 hours to 5 hours, I think you're getting more time for it, because think of all the time that goes into procrastinating on the stuff you don't want to do. Like I typically think if it's only 3 hours a week, you're really like you're getting back like 5 to 7 hours a week sometimes, because there's not all that delaying. Also you might be slower at the tasks. Typically when you hire a freelancer, you're getting a real specialized person that has deep skills and experience. And so they can come in and do things so much faster than we can as the primary business owner.
Yeah, 100%. I think that that's a great point and something for people to keep in mind. And you are right. Like I think there was a lot of tasks where I was like, didn't want to do them. So I'd procrastinate them for a while. And then, something that should take 15, 20 minutes ends up taking an hour or something like that. And then I'm like, oh, I'm so behind on everything. I'd love to talk a little bit about, I know one of the things that you kind of specialize in is this idea of like your zone of genius. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is and how we can work with that?
Yeah. So the zone of genius concept comes out of Gay Hendricks' book, The Big Leap. And it's actually part of a bigger framework. So the zone of genius itself is just it's like that ultimate zone, right? It's the work that makes you come alive. It's energizing. It's light. It's easy. It's fun. It's all those things, right? But it's also part of a bigger framework. And I think this is where, if you have heard of Zone of Genius before, typically it's not talked about within the bigger work framework that Gay Hendricks was writing about. And so he calls it the 4 zones of work. And I think of it like a pyramid where the zone of genius is at the top, but at the bottom of this pyramid is the zone of incompetence. And so this is the zone of all the stuff you're not good at. And typically this is the easiest zone to outsource from, because if you're not good at it, it's a lot easier to get help with it, right? The next level, that zone of competence, which is everything you can do, this one is what I consider more of a trap, because as entrepreneurs, we are so good at doing things, right? We're resourceful. There's so much we can do. And so it can be a lot harder to hand these things off, because a lot of times there are things you don't like to do. And so then I've noticed a lot of entrepreneurs feel kind of bad about handing off the things they don't like to do to someone else, but what they're like missing here is that what they don't like to do is actually someone else's zone of genius. And so when you build your team with that in mind, that's where you get like the best synergy, you get the most productivity. And I'd say you also get like the biggest return on your investment in terms of like the work product, because you're getting the best of the best from from other people. And then sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the third zone then is the zone of excellence. And this is another opportunity to outsource. Sometimes it can be considered. Sometimes it's hard to tell where our excellence and genius, like where that line is, because excellence is really the stuff that you are really, really good at. Like you are probably better at most people than others. But it just doesn't light you up the way genius does. It's more draining. Excellence is more draining. I always think of writing for myself as this way, where I'm a really good writer. One of my bachelor's degrees was in English. And so I think I can own that, right? Like I am a good writer. I'm better than most people at writing, but it is so draining. Like when I finish a blog post, I just feel like completely depleted and I need to like recharge afterwards. But speaking, on the other hand, when I do podcast interviews or I present at a conference, either in person or virtually, both, I feel alive and I feel like so energized at the end of those. So that's kind of how an example of how I can see those two kind of differently.
Right. And so the zone of genius would be like the speaking and like the podcast interviews versus like the zone of excellence being the blog stuff. So that might, or the writing. So the zone of excellence isn't necessarily the area that you might like outsource first, but it might be an area that you kind of look at like, hey, this is taking a lot of my time and energy. You know, if you can outsource it, then you will. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And it's something I've practiced in my own business is that I do get help with my content. So I have an editor, kind of an editor slash writer who helps me with that. So then I can just rough things out and I have someone else do like the finishing work on it oftentimes.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I can actually really relate to the writing piece as well. I think it's probably in my zone of excellence also. Like I
Mhm.
feel like I'm, a strong writer and I write well and stuff, but it is the type of thing where I'll often procrastinate it unless I have a really hard deadline from somebody probably other than myself. And then also very kind of like energetically draining for me. So that's kind of interesting that we both have that. It's interesting to think about though. So if somebody's at a point where they're feeling like, okay, my plate is very full, like I'm kind of, eating like a Thanksgiving size plate or like a Christmas size plate of food pretty much constantly, I need to get some of this off my plate. We start looking at maybe the things that we're not skilled in or the things that we don't like to do first in terms of like finding somebody who like those things are their zone of genius, for example. That's right?
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. I think about accounting with that. I feel like that was one of the first things that I outsourced in my business. For a while, I was using, like TurboTax, and my taxes weren't that complicated, and I wasn't making that much money, so it wasn't a huge deal. But it's just something that I really strongly dislike doing. And finally, when I was like, okay, I'm hiring somebody, this is getting more complicated. I'm worried about doing it wrong. This isn't my zone of genius. I feel like that was just something that was such a huge weight off my shoulders. And, there's people who love doing that stuff. And I was like,
Mhm.
cool. I mean, if you love doing this, why am I torturing myself? I'd rather just like pay you to do it and free myself up a little bit.
Yes, that is such an excellent example too of that. Like I don't feel bad at all about handing off my tax prep to an accountant.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely not. And I think the second thing for me was my podcast editing, and I know how to podcast edit. I can do it fine, but having somebody who could do it better than me and could take that off my plate, I feel like was just such a huge relief, and it freed up a ton of my time during the week, which was really relieving.
Yeah, I can see that. And I kind of doubt, I mean, I can just guess that you probably didn't get into podcasting for the editing.
No, definitely not. I mean, I think this is like a lot of yoga teachers can relate that they probably didn't get into yoga teaching to like do
Mhm.
their accounting or their business or their marketing, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I certainly didn't start a podcast to get into podcast editing, but I also started a podcast with a very low budget. So I think I was very aware that I would need to do the editing myself. And I know people who have kind of gone into it in a similar boat where for them, they're like, I'm not going to learn this skill. And I was like, I feel like I need to learn this skill because I can't really, I don't have the budget to pay somebody else at this point. And so it was something that I just learned in order to put the show out.
Yes. And I really love your awareness with that, though, in the beginning, even like you knew, even though you were like, yep, I'm choosing to learn this and I'm going to outsource it someday. I think that intentionality is so important and something that we just don't talk enough. We just don't hear enough about that in business.
Absolutely. And so for anyone who's listening who is like, okay, I need to kind of, go down this route of identifying this for myself. How do you figure out like your zones of work and your zone of genius and what you should start actually outsourcing?
Yeah. So one of the things I recommend to figure this out is actually to do time tracking. So, take a week of your life of work and just notice and write it down, write down what you're doing, every hour or so or every 15 minutes, really making that list. And then once you have like, okay, how did I spend my Monday? Then you can assign one of the zones to each of those activities. And I found that is the best way. It's really tangible and hands-on. I think without it, it gets kind of like ethereal, right? It's just kind of like out there. It's not really clear and it's just kind of murky and you just don't know. But once you can like really like make it more tangible, I think that is the greatest benefit of doing some time tracking. And I usually recommend to do it for about a week, maybe 2 weeks. You don't have to do it forever, but it'll at least give you a starting point too of like, okay, what is especially in terms of like what you can outsource, you can kind of start to see it. Like you don't want to outsource your genius. That defeats the purpose. But although sometimes people do, like I had a client recently who she started working with me because she realized she outsourced her genius. She didn't realize how much she's a food blogger and she didn't realize how much she loved writing her blog posts until she outsourced it. And she was like, oh, I actually love that. So I think if we can, do some of that prep work before you're actually going out to hire, it can also really help you in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. So keeping like a time tracker, and with that, do you kind of write down, how long, like what the task is, how long it takes you on average, and then like how you feel doing it, or what do you usually keep track of with that?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I do it. Just like I like to do it in like 15-minute increments. Like I think about each hour. So you can do it throughout the day, or you could just do it at the end of the day and think back of like all the things you did. And yeah, consider like, how did you feel after? How did you feel during? Like, did you feel alive? Did you feel drained? I kind of keep it simple on that. Like, was it draining or was it like energizing is usually the kind of the barometer that I'm using or the gauge on that. Yeah. And then just like I said, categorizing them, actually categorizing each of the items, like going beyond the feeling and putting it into that 4 zones of work framework, I think is where the insights really start to come alive. And I've been hearing this too from others that have heard me speak on this. I've been getting more and more feedback on how helpful this is. And it's just been really kind of exciting to see that come alive for them. And the way like the weight comes off of them too. Like once you can just make decisions from a different place.
Yeah, absolutely. I can really relate to that like weight coming off, which is really a really beautiful feeling. And so that makes sense. So we're keeping track of everything, we write everything down. And then how do we kind of blend like looking at, okay, here's my budget for hiring somebody and these are the tasks I want them to do with like how do we actually kind of put that together and package that into a way that we're, I guess able to head down the next steps of actually hiring somebody?
Yeah, I usually look at what is the greatest source of pain because like whatever will free you up the most is what you should focus on. And I feel like you can also look at ease. So if there's something that feels very hard to let go of, very hard to outsource, I don't think those are the things to start with. I think it's better to start with the things that are easy to hand off. And that could be like incompetence or competence. It could be in either zone. And usually roles are a blend, right? There's things like you're not good at, and things that you can do in every role in your business. But that's what I usually look at. Like, what is going to free you up the most? Like, what is the most painful for you to be doing right now and getting help with that? And again, I think that's partly how we can use our intuition in this as well, is like kind of being guided by if it's easy to give up or hard. Like the hard, it's like you're just not ready. And you may never outsource that, but it's definitely like you're not ready to outsource. If it feels really hard to let go, then it's not the right time.
Yeah, for sure. I can actually relate to that with podcast editing. Like, I think that was something that I probably could have outsourced earlier on, but I was a little bit like, I feel like it was kind of like for me, like finding a good babysitter. Like I was like, I'd rather not go out for dinner tonight than like have this maybe mediocre babysitter come take care of my baby. Like I want to make sure that I've got the right person that I really trust, with this. And I feel like that is a hard thing when you've worked on something for a while and when you've kind of really built something up. It's like there can be like a little bit of trust issues, I guess, that come up in terms of handing things off to people. And I felt like podcast editing, because I could do it myself, was one of those things that I held on to for a while. But then it was so interesting because once I outsourced it, I got not like a huge influx of messages, but I got a couple messages from people who were like, wow, I like hadn't listened to your show for a while. And I was just like, it sounds so good. Like, what have you been doing differently? And I'm like, oh, somebody else is editing it. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, this is, it's like confirmation for me of like, I found the right person. And also, this was something that somebody else could do better than me.
Yes. Yes. I love that example.
Hey, yoga teachers, we're just taking a quick little break from the podcast to talk about Offering Tree. It's the holiday season, and you might be buying lots of gifts at all sorts of different stores. Are you offering the same opportunity to your audience? One of the reasons I love recommending Offering Tree is because you can create your own online store to sell products like videos or PDFs or even courses in the same place that you build your website, schedule your classes, and run your membership. If you've been hesitating to sell videos because you don't want to learn yet another tech system, then Offering Tree could be the solution you've been waiting for. You don't have to upload your videos to YouTube or Vimeo. Offering Tree hosts them for you. Offering Tree also integrates with Stripe, so it's easy to accept payments for buying or renting store items. And if you already have a website that you love, you can easily embed Offering Tree's courses and membership platforms into your site. But here's why I really love working with Offering Tree. They are a small business just like you and I, and they really listen to their yoga teachers and their wellness entrepreneurs. So if you reach out and you say, hey, I need something on the platform, they're truly going to listen to you. And one of the reasons that the platform is so awesome is because yoga teachers have been helping Offering Tree make it better and better over the years. And of course, it is gifting season, so I have a gift for you too. All listeners of MBO get a special discount on Offering Tree, up to $88 off an annual plan. Head on over to offeringtree.com/MBO to get your discount. Once again, that's offeringtree.com/MBO. Happy holidays and back to the show. Amazing. And so we're looking at like this kind of list of things and we're balancing that with our budget. And then how do we actually hire? Like, what are your tips for actually finding like the right people to hire into your business?
Yeah. Oh, I love this. I have so much passion around the hiring process. So I love this question. I think one of the biggest things to focus on is really the job posting. If you're going to like put your hiring energy into anything, it would be just an impeccable job posting because there's just so much shady stuff out there when it comes to especially freelance job postings. That freelancers typically have had some like bad experiences. And so they're pretty wary, especially the really good ones, like the really talented, high performing freelancers. They're wary and they know it takes energy, right? It takes energy to apply and they know you only have one position. And so they know like you might have 10, 20, 30 people that they're going up against. And so they have to weigh those options, right? So that's why I think the job posting is the most critical element. Like, I think there's a lot of things you can do wrong in the hiring process and you will be okay, but you have to get the job posting right.
Yeah, for sure. And so if we've never like written a job posting before, how do we make sure that we're kind of getting that right? Like, what are some key pieces to make sure we're including in like a good job posting?
Yeah. So, well, I want to take a step back from that before I share those specifics and just mention a few of the like some of the errors people are making. Because I think if we can fix some of those things and there's some awareness around that it will be helpful. That be okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I was thinking about this recently. Like I've just really noticed like, what are these people getting wrong? What are business owners getting wrong? And I think it comes down to three things. And sometimes it's a combination. Like you could really have all three things in your job posting for real. Okay. The first one is they're too vague. So this looks like a couple sentences in a Facebook group that like if your job posting is 2 or 3 sentences, it's not enough. Like you're not going to get the best people to apply for it, because they can tell you're not clear. If you don't have details, they know that you don't know what you want to outsource. And so they're not going to go after that opportunity. The second thing that often happens is business owners expect too much from one person because we're so capable, right? Us as entrepreneurs, you and I, we tend to be more generalists. There's a lot of things we can do. We're super resourceful. We do have our zone of genius, but we can do a lot of things. But freelancers are more specialized, and they can really tell if you're expecting someone to have three, really if it's 3 to 5 jobs, they can tell. And one of the tests that I use to tell if a job posting is doing this or not is I think about this job posting in a big company. If this job was at a Fortune 500 company, would it be in 3 to 5 different departments? If it's yes, then that's a good sign you're expecting too much from one person and you need to narrow it down and get it more specialized. So you're not asking your social media manager to manage your calendar. You're not asking a writer to schedule all your social media content. Like those are things where they're out of alignment. And that's another red flag to freelancers to stay away. And then the third mistake that I see a lot of entrepreneurs making in their job postings for freelancers is they're too complicated. It's like they're making the language fancier or like fluffier because they think that's going to make it more attractive. But what it ends up doing is it ends up confusing freelancers. And this looks like big words. So if your job posting is filled with words that are 3 or 4 syllables long, that is going to be another deterrent just because they aren't going to know what you want them to do. And so one of the things I suggest for making sure that your job posting is simple is to check the reading grade on it. So you can do this in Word. I think Google Docs has it too, or you can just copy and paste it into a website. There are just websites out there that will grade your content. And really, you should be looking for like a 3rd to 4th grade reading level because people are looking at this online. They're going fast. They're probably they could be looking at 100 other postings that day. And so you have to stand out by being simple and honest too. I mean, again, I think if you're trying to like fluff it up and make it sound better, it's not helping. And I get where it comes from. This one really comes from, people that have experience in big companies hiring. So if you've had a job at a big company, I mean, I think of something like Amazon or McDonald's, like they are giant companies. And so they can do whatever they want in their job posting and people are going to apply because they know who the company is. But when we're like these small businesses, we can't do the same things. We really can't look to the Fortune 500, the Fortune 100 list and look at what they're doing and write our job postings in the same way.
Right. Yeah. And there's like almost nothing worse than a job posting being embellished and then you get in the job and you realize that it's like really not what you applied for at all. Because I feel like then that just creates kind of like employee unhappiness a little bit. Like I think it's really important to kind of keep things real in terms of like what you want somebody to do. And, there's some admin work that's just not the most glamorous. And I don't think we should be trying to glamorize the things that we need people to help us with.
Yes. Yes. I love those words. Embellished, glamorized. Those are excellent. So much better than fanced up.
I like that too.
It's like a family word for us. Anyway, it's just a family word from a little kid. So.
I'm gonna borrow it. I'm gonna start using it. Fanced up. I love it. Amazing. And so
that was a lot of passion though, right? Like
yeah.
Take a breath on that was like, I have a lot of passion around job postings and I just
I think it's great though. Like, and I think it's good to know what not to do. So then can we talk about like the things that we should do? Because obviously, there's a lot of job postings out there. And I think that this kind of like, embellishment and glamorizing and fanced up comes from wanting to stand out. Mm-hmm. So it's like, how do we stand out without kind of, doing those things?
Yeah. So I think it's clear that like one of the ways that you're going to stand out is by being specific by having the role be aligned, like have your responsibilities align with the job itself, the actual role. And then I think also that it's simple. Isn't that almost funny? I mean, it's like a paradox, right? Right? You're going to stand out by writing a simpler job posting, like by having simple language. That is what's going to stand out. A couple other areas that I would really watch for are your responsibilities and your qualifications. And you really should have both of these sections in your job posting. It's one of the things I've noticed, and I would call them that too. I think, again, sometimes people add fancy language on to these sections, and then it's a lot harder for a freelancer to know what you're talking about if you're calling it something else. And so I think it's important, again, it comes down to the language. And yeah, having like a really good list of responsibilities and qualifications is going to help.
Yeah, definitely. And so if you're looking for somebody who's kind of, maybe an admin assistant or something who's going to be doing, a lot of different tasks, and there are kind of like a lot of different responsibilities, how do we kind of balance that to make sure that it's like clear and organized and attractive for somebody who is a freelancer, yet not kind of getting into that realm of like overwhelming, confusing, like unclear what you actually want them to do?
Yeah, I usually do a forced ranking. So, and I recommend this as well. So when you're thinking about what you want to outsource, if you can put them in the order of importance to you, and also in terms of how much like time you think will be spent on them, that is a really good way too, because that's kind of what freelancers are expecting from us. It's one of their expectations is when they look at a job posting. I don't know why this is. I don't know like who decided it was going to be this way, but it's something I've noticed about job posting is we tend to assume that the top three are the most important, and then they get like less important as you go down the list.
Okay. So kind of looking at like what is going to be like the most important tasks that somebody might be doing, like, every week or every day or whatever it is, and outlining those ones first. And then, putting some maybe like miscellaneous tasks closer to the end of the job posting.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like a must have, want to have, nice to have kind of ordering, if you can imagine that. And I usually try to aim for like 7 to 9 bullets. I try to limit myself just so that it helps. It's kind of like a guardrail, right? It just kind of gives me a guideline to go off of so that I know I'm not getting the role too big for the specialist that I'm hiring. And even for admins, right? Like, sometimes people expect their virtual assistants to write a blog post or repurpose emails into blog posts. I've seen all of this. And that's where it's just not realistic for the role itself. So it still needs to connect. It's kind of like these three elements really need to be in harmony.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I feel like this is just thinking about my own experience with hiring. Like, I feel like it's been so much more straightforward to do something like hire an accountant. Like, I'm like, I need my taxes done. It's like a very straightforward, simple task. Or like hiring a podcast producer where it's like, this is what I need done with my podcast versus hiring, my assistant was a little bit more of like, I had to go through the process of writing out, a lot of the stuff we've talked about, like keeping track of what things I was doing, what things I was procrastinating, what things were not in my zone of genius. And then I think it's one thing that's been cool is like, since I've hired somebody is like really getting a feel for like her and her strengths and things she's interested in. And there's tasks she does now that like we never talked about when we had our initial conversation because they weren't things that I necessarily saw as like immediate things for her to help with. But then after I'm like, oh, cool, you have interest in this. Like, I'm super happy to like pass this over to you. And so I think that's kind of like the cool thing about hiring somebody is you can kind of discover them and their strengths and see how they can support your business in a bigger way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, those two roles you mentioned, the podcast editor and the accountant, I feel like they have more natural boundaries built into them, right? Like my accountant would never say yes to writing a blog post, and I would never even think to ask him to do that. And so I think there's some boundary stuff too. I think some of these roles are still kind of new, like social media manager, virtual assistant. I mean, when we think about the last 100 years of work, these are very new roles. And I think that's one of our challenges as entrepreneurs is that there are not like we have to navigate the boundaries with the individual contractors. And sometimes that can be hard, like depending how much experience we have with setting boundaries and how much experience the contractor has with setting boundaries, it can vary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, one thing that's kind of, I guess, interesting about I've been on the side of like being a freelancer and a contractor and also hiring them is like you do kind of have to set clear boundaries on both sides because I mean, for most people, they're not just working for you if they're like an assistant that's only working like 3 or 5 hours a week, right? Like they probably have other
Mhm.
things on the go. And so that it's kind of like, you have to sort of balance that a little bit. And I think that that's like a big difference between, say, if you had like a full time employee that worked with you versus hiring a freelancer. One thing I'm curious about is in a job posting, obviously we put how many hours we're looking for. Is there anything else that you kind of like clearly state when it comes to like, this is a contract role or this is a freelance role versus like I'm hiring part time or full time?
Yeah, I think usually the hours indicate that. And it kind of depends where you're posting too. I mean, with freelance positions, I wouldn't put it on a platform that typically has more employee jobs on them. I mean, most people are looking on Facebook, they're using Upwork, they're using Guru. So some of that becomes irrelevant. You can definitely add it though. I mean, you can just say it like directly. I'm pretty direct with my job postings because again, going for that simple language, just want it simple and easy to tell. But usually if you're only looking for 3 to 5 hours or 5 to 7 hours, it's implied that it is a contract role. But you can definitely state that in yeah, I was trying to think of where you would put it. I think in the qualifications is a good spot uh as well.
And then maybe just clarify in like an interview or whatever,
Mhm.
clarify that there's, it's an hourly type role, that there's no like paid time off or holiday benefits or anything like that, and that type of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. This has been so informative. Is there anything else you want to share about how we can go through the process of hiring, the importance of hiring, anything else we need to know about job listings, any of that type of thing?
Yeah, I think what I want every business owner to know, every entrepreneur to know is that they really do deserve support and that it is worth it. But it's going to take some learning, especially if you've never managed someone before. It's going to be a growth opportunity. But that growth, it's so worth it in the long run because I do think it gets easier and easier the more practice you have at it. So while it can be challenging, it can be scary and all those things, it's also so rewarding when you find that amazing freelancer to be on your team and you feel so much more supported. It's just worth all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I can certainly echo that from experience. And I think that it can be really scary when you're hiring for the first time and you're working for yourself. And maybe if your income's, a little inconsistent, like some months are really great, other months, you're making a little bit less money. It can be really scary to kind of bring somebody into your space and into your team. And kind of like I said before, it can even be like a little bit of like a trust exercise where you're like passing over these things that you've always done to somebody and trusting that they do them in the same capacity that you're doing them or at the same quality that you're doing them. But yeah, I think for me, like just going through the process of passing things off and hiring, great people and having that support, I think it's been so worth it. And I think it just really does allow you to maximize your time and then focus your time on other things like being able to teach more classes or teach more privates or run more workshops. Like that's a really beautiful thing to do when you kind of give up control over aspects of your business that you're spending a lot of time on that you don't necessarily need to be spending time on.
Mhm.
Amazing. Emily, can you share where people can go to find you, learn more about you, all of that good stuff?
Yeah. So I'm at emilyperron.com and I have tons of resources out there for every step of the hiring process. So there's tons of good stuff there. And then I'm also on Instagram at emily.perron. And I love hearing from podcast listeners there. So if you have any other questions or feedback from the episode that your top takeaway, you can definitely send me a direct message over there. I love hearing from people there.
Awesome. I will make sure there's links to all of that in the show notes, and just want to say a huge thank you for your time today and for your wealth of knowledge. This has been really great.
Thank you so much again.
All right, friends, I hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast with Emily Perron. Make sure you go check her out and everything that she's up to and get lots of good resources and that type of thing from her and her website. And Emily and I continued this episode of the podcast on MBO behind the scenes, talking about her process for hiring. So what she first did when she was looking for somebody to hire, how she decided what she needed to outsource, and what she's learned through the process of hiring over the last couple of years of running her business. So she kind of talks us through what she did at first, what worked, what didn't work, what she's learned along the way, and how she's structured her dream team now. So lots of goodness if you are looking to go through the hiring process at, the rest of this year in 2021 or perhaps into 2022. So if you'd like to get access to that, head on over to patreon.com/MBM Yoga. I would love to see you there. And of course, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, Offering Tree. Make sure you go check them out, offeringtree.com/MBOM to get a special discount. And of course, if you have any questions about whether or not Offering Tree is right for you and your business, make sure you reach out to myself or to the Offering Tree team and just, set up a demo, get your questions answered, all of that good stuff. And thank you for listening to this episode of the show. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you share it on social media or with a yoga teacher friend. That is super helpful to get more people listening. All right, that's all for me. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbomyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbomyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.